Have you ever realized that you might actually prefer being lied to? Not consciously. Of course, you say you want honesty. You say you hate manipulation. You say you value freedom. But the moment the raw truth threatens your comfort, most people retreat instantly. Because the radical truth is terrifying, not because it hurts your feelings, but because it demands something almost nobody truly wants. Absolute responsibility. The truth means nobody is coming to save you. Nobody forced you into your habits, your weakness, your wasted years, your fears. And deep down, that level of freedom feels unbearable. So instead, people choose something softer, a predictable cage, a curated reality where somebody else tells them what to think, who to blame, what to fear, and how to behave. And the terrifying part is this. Most people don't resist manipulation. They subconsciously invite it, because being managed feels safer than being free. But later in this video, I'm going to show you the hidden psychological contract almost everyone signs without realizing it, the contract that trades human freedom for emotional comfort. And once you see it, you'll start noticing it everywhere, in relationships, in media, in politics, in social circles, even inside your own mind. Because manipulation only works when the victim secretly benefits from the lie. And that's the part nobody wants to admit. The price of predictability. The human brain does not prioritize truth. It prioritizes emotional stability. That changes everything. Most people imagine themselves as rational beings searching for objective reality. But psychologically, the brain is more like a survival machine trying to reduce uncertainty at all costs. Because uncertainty creates stress. And stress feels dangerous. Even if the truth could improve your life, your nervous system often rejects it automatically if it threatens emotional comfort. That's why predictable pain feels safer than uncertain freedom. Think about how many people stay in toxic relationships they already understand, not because they're happy, but because familiarity creates psychological control. The known misery becomes emotionally manageable. The unknown future does not. This is why manipulation works so effectively. Manipulators do not merely deceive people. They remove uncertainty. They create emotional structure. And the human brain becomes addicted to structure, even false structure, because false structure often feels easier than reality itself. Reality is chaotic. Reality is complex. Reality requires thinking. Manipulation simplifies everything. It gives people villains, heroes, instructions, identities, tribes, narratives, and most people will surrender independent thought if it means escaping uncertainty. That's why modern society increasingly rewards scripted behavior. Notice how people rehearse conversations before they happen, curate personalities online, filter opinions based on approval. Everything becomes performance because authenticity contains risk. Scripts contain safety. You already see this in everyday interactions. How are you? Good. Most conversations are rituals, not truth exchanges. People don't want honesty. They want predictability. And the more emotionally fragile society becomes, the more it craves curated realities. That's where the velvet cage begins. Not an obvious prison, a comfortable one. A psychologically padded environment where people slowly surrender agency in exchange for relief. The velvet cage says, don't think too hard. Just follow the system. Trust the narrative. Trust the trend. Trust the group. And in return, you are rewarded with temporary emotional comfort. But every comfort has a price. The price is autonomy. The price is critical thought. The price is becoming psychologically dependent on external guidance. And the terrifying part, Most people never notice it happening because the cage is soft, not painful. That's what makes it dangerous. And in a moment, I'll show you how modern systems are designed to deepen this dependency until people lose the ability to distinguish their own thoughts from programmed desires. The architecture of the comfortable lie. Modern manipulation is no longer obvious. That's why it's so effective. The greatest manipulators today do not control people through force. They control them through convenience. And convenience is one of the most addictive drugs ever created. Your phone already knows what you want before you search for it. Algorithms predict your emotions, your impulses, your fears, your desires. They study your attention span, your hesitation patterns, the exact type of content that keeps you emotionally stimulated long enough to stay dependent. This creates a frictionless existence. Everything becomes personalized, curated, optimized, and while this feels empowering, it slowly weakens psychological independence. Because every system that constantly predicts your behavior eventually begins shaping it. That's the hidden exchange. People believe they're consuming content. In reality, the content is consuming them. Every recommendation subtly narrows perspective. Every validation loop reinforces identity. Every outrage cycle trains emotional reflexes. And over time, people stop exploring reality. They start inhabiting customized psychological tunnels. This is why so many people ignore obvious red flags. Not because they're stupid, but because acknowledging those red flags would destabilize the internal story holding their world together. A partner lies repeatedly, but the victim rationalizes it. An influencer contradicts themselves constantly, but followers defend them. A system clearly fails, yet people protect it emotionally. Why? Because humans protect emotional stability more aggressively than truth. Truth threatens identity, and identity is one of the strongest addictions in existence. People don't just become attached to beliefs. They become attached to the emotional safety those beliefs provide. That's why original thinkers are often punished socially, because independent thought introduces instability into group narratives, and groups instinctively suppress instability. Notice how modern environments reward compliance through dopamine, likes, notifications, validation, approval. Everything becomes behavioral conditioning. You post something socially accepted, reward. You repeat the approved narrative, reward. You think independently and create friction, punishment, isolation, ridicule. Humans evolved to fear exile from the tribe. Modern systems weaponize that fear psychologically. And slowly, people stop asking, "Is this true?" Instead, they ask, "Will this be accepted?" That single shift changes the entire structure of thought. Because once social survival becomes more important than objective truth, manipulation becomes self-sustaining. People begin policing themselves. They willingly censor their own perceptions, not because somebody forced them to, but because emotional comfort became more valuable than freedom. And this leads to one of the darkest realizations of all. Many people don't actually want the truth. They want reassurance, even if the reassurance is fake. But the next part is where this becomes dangerous, because radical truth destroys reassurance completely. And most people are psychologically unprepared for what remains afterward. The burden of radical truth. Radical truth is not motivational. It is not comforting. It is brutal, because radical truth removes every psychological hiding place. It forces you to confront reality without anesthesia. No excuses, no scapegoats, no comforting narratives, only consequence. That's why most people instinctively avoid it. Because radical truth demands accountability. Imagine removing every external explanation for your life. No blaming society endlessly. No blaming parents forever. No blaming luck. No blaming timing. Just you, your decisions, your patterns, your fears, your discipline, your avoidance. Most people say they want freedom, but freedom without excuses feels terrifying, because once manipulation disappears, choice becomes unavoidable, and choice creates pressure. Suddenly, you are responsible for building meaning, responsible for direction, responsible for action, responsible for failure. That's why many people freeze when external structure disappears. Take away the script, and they collapse into paralysis, because they never learned how to think independently. They only learned how to react to systems, school systems, social systems, corporate systems, digital systems. Everything teaches behavioral compliance. Very little teaches psychological sovereignty. And without sovereignty, freedom feels like falling into a void. This is why people often return to toxic environments voluntarily, not because they enjoy suffering, but because chaos without guidance feels worse than controlled misery. The cage at least provides orientation. Even abusive systems create certainty, and certainty calms the nervous system. That's why manipulation can feel emotionally comforting. The manipulator makes decisions for you, defines reality for you, tells you who to become, who to hate, what success means. And if things go wrong, perfect. Now you have somebody to blame. That's the hidden psychological relief of being managed. It removes existential responsibility. You no longer need to carry the full weight of your life. Somebody else carries it for you, at least temporarily. But eventually, this creates psychological decay, because every avoided decision weakens self-trust. Every surrendered responsibility weakens identity. Every dependence reduces internal power. And slowly, people lose the ability to tolerate uncertainty at all. That's when manipulation becomes nearly irresistible, because the more emotionally fragile someone becomes, the more desperately they crave external direction. And what happens next is something most people never notice. They begin actively inviting deception into their lives. The mechanics of invisible management. Most manipulation is consensual. That's the uncomfortable truth. People think manipulation only happens when a predator targets a victim, but often the victim unconsciously participates in the arrangement because deception provides emotional advantages. Think about how often people avoid asking difficult questions, avoid confronting uncomfortable realities, avoid investigating contradictions. Why? Because clarity creates responsibility, and responsibility requires action. Sometimes people would rather remain deceived than face what truth demands from them. That's why invisible management works so well. People outsource thinking constantly to influencers, to institutions, to trends, to authority figures, to relationship partners, not because humans are weak, but because independent decision-making consumes energy. Critical thinking is psychologically expensive. Being managed is efficient. That's why many people secretly enjoy dominant personalities, not only romantically, socially, politically, psychologically. Strong personalities reduce ambiguity. They provide direction, certainty, identity. And when uncertainty rises in society, people become increasingly vulnerable to anyone offering simplified answers. That's why emotionally exhausted populations become easier to control. Tired minds seek relief, not truth. And once someone accepts external management emotionally, they begin constructing justifications for it. If this fails, it's not my fault. They told me this was right. I was just following guidance. Notice the pattern? Management creates built-in scapegoats. That's psychologically attractive, because failure hurts less when responsibility feels shared. But radical freedom removes scapegoats entirely. And many people subconsciously fear that level of exposure more than manipulation itself. This also explains why humans often choose known negative outcomes over unknown positive possibilities. A miserable relationship feels safer than uncertain loneliness. A dead-end job feels safer than uncertain ambition. A fake identity feels safer than authentic rejection. The known pain becomes psychologically domesticated. The unknown remains terrifying. And manipulators understand this deeply. They do not merely sell lies. They sell emotional predictability. That's why people cling to harmful narratives long after evidence collapses. The narrative itself becomes emotional shelter. Destroy the narrative, and suddenly the person must confront uncertainty naked. That feels psychologically catastrophic. So instead, many people defend the lie harder, even against reality itself. And here's the darkest part. The longer someone remains psychologically managed, the more painful freedom becomes. Because freedom requires rebuilding internal strength from scratch. And most people have spent years weakening that muscle. But there is still a way out. The problem is that escaping manipulation does not feel empowering at first. It feels horrifying, because the final stage is not comfort. It is terrifying freedom. Reclaiming the terrifying freedom. The first step toward freedom is brutally simple. Audit your reality, not emotionally, objectively. Ask yourself, where have I traded autonomy for comfort? Where am I following scripts I never consciously chose? Which beliefs genuinely belong to me, and which were inherited through repetition, fear, or conditioning? Most people never ask these questions seriously, because the answers destabilize identity. But awareness is the beginning of psychological sovereignty. You cannot reclaim freedom while remaining addicted to emotional sedation. And make no mistake, comfort can become sedation, especially digital comfort, infinite distraction, infinite entertainment, infinite validation, infinite noise. A mind constantly stimulated cannot hear its own authentic thoughts. That silence terrifies people, because silence exposes what distraction hides. That's why many people panic when left alone with themselves. No notifications, no media, no stimulation. Suddenly, unresolved fears surface, regret surface, confusion surfaces, identity fractures surface. And rather than confront this honestly, people often return immediately to distraction, back into the cage, because the cage protects them from themselves. But freedom requires emotional endurance. You must build the ability to tolerate uncertainty without collapsing psychologically. That means learning to stand in discomfort without immediately searching for reassurance. Learning to question your own narratives. Learning to survive social disapproval. Learning to exist without constant validation. That is psychological adulthood, and almost nobody teaches it. Start small. Observe where your opinions instantly mirror group consensus. Notice which truths emotionally trigger defensive reactions. Pay attention to environments where authenticity feels dangerous. Those are clues, because manipulation thrives wherever fear controls perception. And one of the most important skills you can develop is separating emotional comfort from objective reality. Just because something feels safe does not mean it is true. Just because something feels uncomfortable does not mean it is false. That distinction changes lives. Because truth often arrives as disruption first, not comfort. The people who reclaim autonomy are not fearless. They simply become willing to experience uncertainty without surrendering themselves. That's real power, not domination over others. Domination over your own need for psychological sedation. And eventually, something strange begins happening. You stop craving management. You stop needing constant reassurance. You stop outsourcing identity because your relationship with uncertainty changes. The unknown no longer feels like death. It feels like possibility. That's when the cage loses its power completely. And suddenly, the controlled safety of manipulation begins to feel smaller than the terrifying openness of freedom. Most people will never reach this point because freedom demands continuous responsibility, continuous self-awareness, continuous adaptation. There is no permanent comfort zone, only reality, unfiltered, unpredictable, alive. And maybe that's why so many people choose manipulation instead, because cages are exhausting. But freedom is heavier, at least in the beginning. But one path slowly kills your mind. The other forces it to evolve. So here's the real question. If someone removed every comforting lie from your life tomorrow, would you actually want the truth that remains? Or would you search for another cage? Let me know in the comments. What's one uncomfortable truth you realized recently that completely changed the way you see people or yourself?